The battle for the mind of North America will be fought in the video arena.
Welcome to Glenray Hall, everyone. My name is Benita Pedersen. I'm one of the helpers with this event. I was invited by Sheane to be here and to assist with the event in various ways, including MC. And so this event is happening due to Sheane and some other wonderful people. Let's give them a round of applause, the presenters, the volunteers that put this together. Thank you. And so one of the things I'd like you to take note of as you're here is at the back of the room, we do actually have some of the flyers from Alberta Prosperity Project. So be sure to take a look and take home some flyers. And if you have questions about Alberta Prosperity Project, we have someone here to answer those questions for you. Another organization represented here today is the Alberta Conservative Association, and you can enter to win an Alberta flag sponsored by the Alberta Conservative Association by just texting 780-349-0181. So put your name on there, put Alberta flag, and you can enter to win. Now, we're going to hear from Sheane Meikle, and he is a historian. It was at the age of 13 when he read the Alberta Act, and he was fascinated by it. And so he's been studying politics, actively involved in politics, actively involved in policy making and in evaluating policy for the current governing party of Alberta. And I'm getting more involved with him myself with different events. I work with him and his wife from time to time on different events, including a special event happening July 1st that you're all invited to. It's on July 1st. It's called Albertans Day. And we invite you to come to that event and bring the most beautiful flag on the planet with you. Perhaps you'll win one for free today through Alberta Conservative Association, but bring the most beautiful flag. How many would agree? The Alberta flag is the most beautiful flag. So let's give a big welcome now to Sheane Meikle. Give him a big round of applause.
Good evening. Well, as Benita said, I've been interested in the history of the province. I have been interested in the history of the province of Alberta since the first time I read the Alberta Act, which was when I was 13 years of age. And I knew right then and there that over time, this wasn't going to work the way it was currently written. And I will take you through a little bit of the history tonight of the discrepancies between Ottawa and the province of Alberta. The first thing I want to do is I want to read a quote that was given by Clifford Sifton in 1903 in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Now, you're going, well, who is that? He was the Interior Minister that actually wrote the Alberta Act. And this quote is, "We desire, and all Canadian patriots desire, that the great trade of the prairies shall go to the east, or go to enrich the people to the east, to build our factories and our places of work, and in every legitimate way to our prosperity." Well, right there off the bat, we're behind the eight ball when the guy that's going to write the Alberta Act says that. But I'm going to go back just for a second, even farther back in time, to 1897. And that is when the Crow rate was introduced. Now, the Crow rate was introduced by the federal government because they paid for most of the railway across Canada. So they said to the railway that if we're going to pay for the railway, you're going to have to ship grains and other commodities at a fixed rate. Well, what they did in that is that fixed rate ran for over 100 years. So the railways didn't want to ship the grain to the west coast. They wanted to ship it east where they didn't have any restrictions, and the farmers would pay more for it. So for over 100 years, they didn't want to go into the small towns anymore. They didn't want to, because that just cost them money. So under the Crow rate, they just refused to take it, unless you would sign a contract to take it to the east. And the reason is because that wasn't their fault. That was the federal government right then and there setting a fixed rate that didn't change in over 100 years. So let's now go back even one more step to 1872. In 1872, the Dominions Land Act was enacted. And what that did is give the federal government all say over the territories. The existing provinces were not affected. Now, you'll go, well, we became a province in 1905. Well, the thing is we're going to jump now to the Alberta Act of 1905. And in there, they kept Alberta and Saskatchewan under the Dominions Land Act. And it wasn't until 1950 that we got out from underneath that. So we were treated, our land was treated as if it was federal land. And they could tell us exactly what to do with all of our land. but no other provinces had that restriction on them. Only the Western province, only Alberta and Saskatchewan actually in that one, and then the Northwest Territories and the Yukon. They also brought in the natural resources under the Alberta Act. The natural resources remain under federal control. So that took till 1930 to get back what all the other provinces already had in place. When we became a province, we were supposed to get that, but we weren't transferred that until 1930, back under their control. The federal control over public lands and public works is still in effect for only Alberta and Saskatchewan. We have fought back lots and lots of it, but that's what we had continually are fighting to get back. We are the only province that we have the most federal parks of anywhere in Canada for province. The next one, surprise, surprise, is Saskatchewan. But ours is over one third of our province is federal parks. No other province has that. Their federal parks are very small, not like ours, where they take up just the three big ones, Wood Buffalo, Banff, and Jasper. That's almost a third right there, just those three parks. And then you add in the smaller ones. And we've been fighting to get that back since we were formed. And it's still, we don't have it back. As far as I'm concerned, the provincial government should just tell the federal government to pound sand on that, because that's actually our land to do so. The Sovereignty Act would take care of that. It just needs to be done. In 1931, the Statute of Westminster was issued by the King of England. Now, this affected every province in Canada under the Dominion. There's a lot of guys that have ways that they want to do it, and they're right in theory, but in practicality, it would never work. But what that says in there is it gave the sovereignty of Alberta, I'll use Alberta as an example, to the people of Alberta in control of the provincial government. So it cut Ottawa right out. But amazingly, they just seemed to ignore it. And because we were still governed at that point in time by the House of Lords. And the King signed that into effect, but it was never implemented. We'll step back a little bit now to the Train Act. In 1913, the federal government introduced the Train Act. And what the Train Act did is no Western province that had its own trains, so the Alberta Railroad, the Alberta Central Railroad, the Northern Railroad, could do interprovincial trade. That means that even their rail cars could not be transferred and go over the border between provinces. Only the Eastern Railways were allowed to do so. So like CPR could do it because CN didn't exist at the time. CP Rail could do it. The Ontario Northern Railway could go into Winnipeg, which they did at that time. But Alberta could not go across. The Alberta Central, the Alberta Northern, none of those railways could cross a border. They could only work within their province. So it only applied to the West. Most people don't realize that caused most of the railways to start folding. So in 1931, they nationalized all of those. They took over, when they went bankrupt, the federal government took over their assets. And when they took over their assets, in 1931, they nationalized it, and that's how CN was formed. From the majority of it was from Western railways that went under, and they took over their assets. Now it's owned by, they sold it out, but it was still, it was planned that way. In 1913, they also came out with the Train Safety Act. So they've all just come out with the Train the Train Act. Now they come out with the Train Safety Act. And Eastern railways were exempt. So only Western ones had to implement these safety requirements, which all the smaller railways in the West, it was a lot harder than if CP or any of them had to do it. So, and it only applied to the Western provinces. Well, it also applied to the Maritimes, but they didn't have really anything there at the time. Okay, now we'll jump forward to 1940 to 1945 and national conscription. The war's going on. Most people don't realize that when they brought conscription in, they gave Ontario and Quebec the right to cap it. So the West and the Maritimes could not do if you hit a certain age, you went to war. But in Ontario and Quebec, when they hit a certain number, a certain percentage, they could cap it. Didn't have to go to war after that. Which doesn't seem quite right, but that's just the way it was. Now we're going to fly forward to probably one of the most controversial things that happened that even people from that generation don't remember, because somehow it got stymied and nobody remembers it. The Flag Act of 1965 and the controversy behind that. Everybody knows the unifying of the red-white flag with a big old sugar maple leaf in the middle of it. Well, did you know that was such a controversial flag at the time that not a single Western MP voted for it, because they either wanted a modification of the red ensign or they wanted the Manitoba maple on it, which actually represented coast to coast, because the Manitoba maple is found coast to coast. It was brought forward as a whipped bill, which, if you don't know what a whipped bill is, it means that the government says to the MP that if you don't vote that way, you're kicked out of caucus. So it was brought forward by Lester B. Pearson's government as a whipped bill. So all the Easterners voted for it, and all the Westerners voted against it. And even when we hit Confederation 2 years later, many towns in the West would not show that flag. And yet, by the time I started school in 1973, it was the flag. Everybody was so happy about it. It was a unifying flag. It just sort of got forgotten somehow. But when you think about it, that's why that will never be my flag. If I'm talking about Canada, I'll talk about the red ensign. When you know the history of the maple leaf, as soon as I knew that was no longer. It was once again a boot in the back of the Western Canada. Then we come to 1969 and the Official Languages Act. Okay, that meant that English and French had to be everywhere in Canada, except Quebec. They were exempt from it. They did not have to comply. So that's why they were able to bring in the 80s, bring in the French only language. But under that act, Alberta couldn't bring in an English only language. So now they expanded this in the 90s to make it so that even the legislatures have to keep records in French in their legislatures, which is absolutely ridiculous. So they don't have to speak it on the floor of the ledge, but they have to keep the documents in French as well, which is thousands of dollars every year to do so, to keep a separate people there to translate and put it into documents. Alberta has fought that one since it was brought in, because we have such a small francophone. But I don't know if you remember when they were forcing Manitoba to do it. Manitoba is now forced to do it everywhere where they have any access to federal land has got to have on their stop signs things like stop arrête on their signs, which is, when you got to get them printed like that, it costs way more money. when they only place like St. Pierre and like have French, and fine, you want to do it in those towns? Great. Why do you have to do it everywhere? Then we come to the big one, the National Energy Program. Now, how many in here know exactly what the National Energy Program was? Okay, a few. Okay, so basically the basic part of the National Energy Program is the federal government said to the province of Alberta that you cannot sell your oil on the open market. You must sell it to us at a reduced rate below world value. So what did that do to the Alberta economy? It crashed it, big time. Thankfully, we had a premier at the time that fought it like crazy. But in the meantime, if anybody was a working age in the 1980s, you will remember that the oil patch was dead. And that was because of the National Energy Program. The oil companies were pulling out. They didn't want to drill if they had to not take world value for it. Why would they? So they were stopping production and shutting things down, because why would they want to produce and lose money on it? We were selling it at times to the east for less than what it cost them to produce it. It made no sense. Thankfully, Lougheed was able to fight it and got it repealed. And that was through the federal courts finally, and through the Supreme Court. So it's one of the times that the Supreme Court has actually been on our side. Then we come to 1982 and the patriotic time, when we had the repatriation of the Canadian Constitution. Well, there were two provinces that didn't sign originally, Alberta and Saskatchewan. Did not sign. Do you know why they did not sign? They were the only two provinces that were not consulted at all in the writing of the new Constitution. Every other province was consulted by the federal government except for Alberta and Saskatchewan. You would think when you have a document that is going to affect all Canadians that you would consult all Canadians. To me, that just makes sense. But not to them, apparently. So until the Meech Lake Accords and then the Charlottetown Accords, Alberta did not sign on. Gord will talk a little bit about it because he was actually at the Charlottetown Accords. So he can talk a little bit about it. But when they did sign on, I don't think they should have, but they did. But originally, they would not sign on to onto the Constitution. And just think, we could be like Quebec, where they're bending over backwards for us. In 1982, they also did an update on the Languages Act, which made it tougher. And I talked about them before, is what they did. And that made it so that everybody has to do everything in French, just about. And it just is an economic burden on the West. Okay, so now we're going to take a big jump forward. Now, it's not that they didn't do anything in those years in between, because believe me, there were a lot of things. But if I was to get into everything that they did, we would be here forever, because they just try to kill our economy continually. They bring in bills, they stand for a little bit, and then they get fought and defeated in court, and it just, every step is to try and kill our economy. And most of them were easy to defeat until we get to the late 2010s. In 2018, they brought in the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act. Now, the Ottawa government fought this in court, and actually the Supreme Court said, you are right, it is 100% in your jurisdiction. However, because of climate control, we're going to rule in the favor of the federal government. So there the Supreme Court knowingly knew that they were violating the Constitution and still ruled even in their judgment, they admitted that they were violating the Constitution, and yet they ruled in Ottawa's favor, which, as far as I'm concerned, as soon as they did that, the Supreme Court is null and void. When you are not adhering to the Constitution that you have sworn an oath to adhere to, you're not a legitimate body anymore. And then in 2019, another bill that got fought and won. This time they actually won, but still in place. And that is Bill C-69, the No More Pipelines Act, which just before they brought that in, they brought in Bill C-48, which is the oil tanker moratorium. So we can't have pipelines. We can't have pipelines, and then we can't ship to the ports with our oil in the West. So basically, let's kill Alberta's economy. So you start with the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act, which is a direct hit against the oil industry. You follow that up a year later with a tanker moratorium on the West Coast. No, nothing for the East Coast, just for the West Coast. And then you follow that up right away with the No More Pipelines Act. So we can't ship it by pipeline, and we can't ship it by train to get it offshore. Doesn't make any sense. So, as you can see, there has been many, many, many things that have happened throughout the time. But this latest Liberal government has made it impossible to work within the framework of Confederation as it is. You take and you just add to that the bill that was just introduced today, which I'm not going to go into any details, but I would encourage you to go read dramatically Bill C-5, and you're going to be shocked. I don't want, until they've only tabled it, so it hasn't gone through first reading yet. It's been tabled. So if somebody tables a bill that doesn't have to go to the Parliament, they could pull it out before then. But if they bring Bill C-5, and you can find it on the federal government's website, but I will just say that Bill C-5 makes Carney a dictator in no uncertain terms. Now, hopefully, they pull it. They don't even get it to debate in Parliament. But if they do, hopefully the other parties, because they are still a minority government, the other parties, as much as we aren't fans of the NDP or the Bloc, they don't vote for it, because they still have enough people to defeat it. Because if they do, it is over. And I don't mean that hyperbolically. If you read the Bill C-5 as it stands now, it will shock you. Well, hopefully I gave you some interesting thoughts. We're not going to take questions until the very end, but at this time I'm going to introduce Mr. Joel Mullan. Joel has been involved in politics for several years. He's very knowledgeable. He used to be the VP of Policy and Governance for the United Conservative Party, and he is going to give us a path forward. So I will turn the podium over to Joel at this time.
All right, thank you very much. Well, get comfortable. We're going to be here for a while. Now, I'll start off with telling you a little bit about myself. I spent 17 years in the Royal Canadian Navy. I joined for duty-free beer, and they ended the duty-free beer, so I left. Well, that and they broke me, but that's another story. I got to Alberta in 2015, and shortly thereafter I discovered that the Pinkos had followed me from the coast and Rachel Notley got elected. Let's just say I was less than thrilled. So when Jason Kenney announced his plan to unite the right, I signed on with him. We all make mistakes. But I worked on his first leadership campaign, then the Unite the Right campaign that followed, and then the second leadership campaign. In 2019, as Sheane mentioned, I became the Vice President of Bylaw and Policy for United Conservative Party. I was elected at the annual general meeting. And I ended up finishing about 2 years in that role. It should have been 3. I was elected to fill out someone else's term who had left, so that was the first year. And then I was acclaimed for 2 more years at the following AGM. However, something else happened. Of course, we had COVID. And at first, I was fairly sympathetic towards the government's point of view because nobody really had a handle on what was going on. Everybody was just flailing in the dark, hoping for the best. But by the summer of 2021, that wasn't the case anymore. And when Fat Stalin came back from his holiday, we had a board meeting for the provincial UCP board. Well, at that board meeting, I asked Jason Kenney directly, said, you must be under a massive amount of pressure to do away with or to introduce vaccine passports. And he said, yes. He said, but it'll never happen. Not as long as I'm premier. They're illegal, they're immoral, and I won't do it. About 10 days later, I found out from the news that he had brought them in. So at that point, I became more than a little angry. In fact, it took my wife about 2 days to peel me off of the ceiling. At the end of that time, I decided to call for an immediate leadership review. I also handed a copy of that email to the Western Standard. Well, Jason Kenney and his crowd were not best pleased by what happened. And they decided to use that email that I gave to the Western Standard as a pretext to throw me off the board, despite the fact that I'd been acclaimed by the membership. That meant nothing to them. I hadn't violated board confidentiality. I hadn't said what anybody had said in response to my email. I simply shared my initial email. However, it was a kangaroo court, and they threw me away, and so I spent about 2 weeks on the media circuit, telling anybody who would listen how wrong he was. And then we really got to work seeking to remove Jason Kenney from his role as premier. And over the course of that, I spoke in every small town, I think, in this province. And the ones that I didn't get to, I got to shortly thereafter when I was working on Danielle Smith's leadership campaign. And I have to say, it's been wonderful being involved in Alberta politics, and the places that it's brought me and the people that I've had a chance to meet. This is an absolutely incredible province, and I've had the good fortune to go to places that otherwise I probably never would have been to. Whether it's Vulcan down south or Wabaska, right in the middle of the north, all over the place. It's been fascinating. Anyhow, we just had an election. And I think all of us were hoping and praying it went a different way. And a lot of people were hanging on. I'm not a separatist yet, but if Carney wins, ask me again. So what happens, of course, if Carney wins? All of a sudden, we see a huge spike in separatist sentiment in Alberta. And it's been a struggle, and it continues to be a struggle for people. Generally speaking, our hearts want to remain in Canada, but our heads know it's time to get the hell out. And that's something that we're going to have to overcome in this movement as we strive forward to have a referendum and to win a referendum and actually separate from Canada. We're going to have to overcome the emotional ties that people have to Canada. And that's where folks like you are going to come in. But we'll come back to that. So the issues that we face, why do we need this referendum? Well, first off, I offer you representation at the federal level in Canada. Alberta has the worst representation by members of parliament in this country. For every member of parliament, we have 134,000 people. That is more than any other province. Ontario, it's 132,000. Manitoba, 107,000. Quebec, 116. And then this is where it gets really offensive. Nova Scotia, 98,000. New Brunswick, 85,000. And of course, glorious Prince Edward Island, probably shouldn't even be a province, is 45,000 people per MP. That means their vote is worth almost 3 times what your vote is in Alberta. How the hell did that happen? It's the size of a small town, yet they're guaranteed 4 MPs in the Constitution. They're guaranteed the same number, a minimum, that they have senators. They have 4 senators, so they got 4 MPs. Now the Senate, there's another can of worms. The Senate is divided regionally, with the regions being Maritime, Quebec, Ontario, West, and then Newfoundland is kind of the later add-on. Each region gets 24. So Ontario gets 24, Quebec gets 24. The Maritimes, Nova Scotia gets 10, New Brunswick gets 10. Little old Prince Edward Island, they're there with their 4. They don't even have a population equivalent to Mill Woods. But they got 4 senators. Meanwhile, the 4 western provinces, Manitoba West, get to split 24, so we each get 6. Prince Edward Island, 4 senators. Alberta, 6. Nova Scotia, 10 senators. Alberta, 6. Nova Scotia's population is less than 1 million. It's less than metropolitan Edmonton. Yet they get 10 senators. Now, I'll come back to this in a minute, but I think we need to consider equalization payments in light of where the political power is. So you've got Quebec with their 1 MP for every 116,000. They're 24 senators. They're getting $13.6 billion this fiscal year from the federal government just for being them. Nova Scotia gets $3.5 billion. New Brunswick gets 3.1. PEI, well, they get a bit, but it's really not worth discussing because, again, should it really be a province? So we've concentrated political power in provinces that all have their hands out. And where does that money coming from? It's coming from the provinces that don't have political power. The country has been designed in such a way that they don't have political power. The Supreme Court is rigged. The Supreme Court requires a certain number of judges representing different areas of the country. Alberta has no guarantees. We have, I believe, one member of the Supreme Court right now, but there's no guarantee. And we have no input. We have no input in who's in the Supreme Court because we have no political power. It's the governments that have been elected in the East that get to decide who's on the Supreme Court. And they're picking their pinko buddies. Is everyone depressed now? If you're not, you probably should be. So, we also are faced with this embargo that Sheane has touched on. The West Coast tanker ban and the No More Pipelines bill. Make no mistake, this province is under an embargo. Our product is being blocked from the world markets. And the hypocrisy of these laws, it's just incredible. We know No More Pipelines bill. We know that that is unconstitutional. It's been ruled as such, but the appeal process goes on. The no tankers on the West Coast is absolutely ridiculous. Because on the East Coast, you have massive refineries in St. John, in New Brunswick. That requires tankers coming from other places like the Middle East, bringing the oil in to pass into the Bay of Fundy. And they're passing through northern right whale breeding grounds. There are only a couple hundred specimens left of the northern right whale. It is critically endangered. Yet nothing's being done to protect them. You have oil tankers coming down the St. Lawrence Seaway, going to Montreal. There is a beluga population, a beluga whale population in the St. Lawrence that is also vulnerable. No, it doesn't matter. Meanwhile, you can't swing a cat on the West Coast without hitting an orca. Yet we have a West Coast tanker ban. Somebody explain the logic of that to me, because I don't get it. So what's our way forward? Well, a lot of people are talking about a referendum, and I certainly don't disagree. What would we be fighting for, though? Well, they're the obvious questions, like low tax bracket. If you factor in just what the federal government raises here and how much they distribute in other provinces, we would see our tax rates go down substantially on our own. There have been a number of different studies that I'll leave you to find, but it indicates that our tax rates would go down quite dramatically. It would, of course, end our obligations for equalization. It would increase our market access, because an independent landlocked country has rights to access to tide water. That's dictated by the United Nations Convention Law on the Sea. If we were independent, we would have more rights to tide water than we do now. We would be less landlocked, not more landlocked. And of course, we would be much freer. We look at the slow creep over the last 20 or 30 years from Ottawa that's been gradually eliminating people's rights, freedom of expression, internet, and now we're looking at a law that will allow the federal government to set aside any other law that's inconvenient for them. No, we want to live in a country that has the rule of law. Don't. But the problem with the referendum is we can't afford to go off half-cocked. It's been a generation since Quebec's last referendum. That's the price of failure. If we don't get this right, we will be in a position that is desperately compromised as far as our relationship with Ottawa goes. Ottawa will know they can do whatever the hell they want if we lose. And there's a big piece of the puzzle that's missing right now. Because it's one thing to vote against something, voting against Canada. But what are we voting for? And this is something that really needs to be hashed out. There needs to be, for example, a draft constitution. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be the final one, but we need to know what we're voting for. And I think we need to call upon various groups in the province who are pushing for the referendum to start answering these questions, because they're absolutely critical. Now, I do want to see a referendum. Don't misunderstand me. I just want to get it right. One and done. Thanks very much. So long. See ya. Now, I mentioned earlier that each one of you has a role to play. Part of that is advocating. Oh, I see my dog's gone walkabout. Oh well, feel free to say hi. Yeah, your role. Two key parts to this puzzle. One is we've got to sell it. I draw you back to my comments about head over heart. There are a lot of people who are emotionally invested in Canada. And certainly I get it. I was one of them. In fact, I still am. It still feels unnatural calling for a referendum to me. But the other aspect is you need to make your voices heard within the separation movement and ask those hard questions. What are we stepping into? Demand better. Because if we go into this and have a vote that's simply based on voting against something, we will lose. Election campaigns that succeed are not against something, they're for something. They sell a vision. Right now in rural Alberta, we're looking good. There's great support for a referendum. But if you go to Calgary, that gets a lot weaker. I think you'd be lucky to get a third of the voters in Calgary right now. And Edmonton, well, Edmonton's the heart of darkness. You'd probably be lucky to get 25 votes there right now. So we need to start pushing people gently, in a friendly fashion, but pushing them towards the necessity of a referendum. But we also need to be asking the question of what is the end game going to look like? What are we voting for if we vote yes? So, in order to achieve or flesh out the question for a referendum, Gord has a very interesting proposition here, and that's forcing a constitutional conference. A proper one like it's never happened in this country before, where we all put all our chips on the table and we hash it out. Who knows? Maybe we find some sort of deal that's acceptable. I don't think that's going to happen. But we know what we're leaving. We know what we're leaving, and it'll also tell us what we're headed towards. And my last My last item here is I'm told that I am to push the, or pass the hat around. Obviously, these events aren't free. We have to get the haul. We have to pay for gas going around the province and so on. So, if possible, we'd ask you to dig in and help us out with our costs. So, on that note, I'll collect my dog and turn this over to Gord. So, please give Gord a word of welcome.
Something, we got something going. It'll brighten up here, trust me. So you guys can hear me with this microphone. This is, I got a voice that tends to carry, so I apologize in advance. So my name's Tulk. I'm based out of Red Deer. I'm part of a group called Libertas, Alberta. We've been around since just before COVID, working on policy developments for Canada and Alberta. And not just the policies, but how we get to getting those policies in place, including things like equalization reform, healthcare reform, Senate reform, those kinds of things. So that's what Libertas Alberta is. What I'm here to talk about is the need for a constitutional convention. And basically the theme of it is that we need to be practicing our due diligence when we're regarding the choice between the following things: remaining in Confederation, sovereignty association. You might have heard of that. A lot of people tend to confuse sovereignty association with independence. I noticed Joel was saying separation all the time. I very much, if you want to be emotionally affirmative, I think the term independence is the better word to use rather than separation. Separation has a negative connotation. I think independence has a much more positive one. And independence. Those are really our choices. So the basis of a breakup, let's talk about how we talk about emotions and whatnot. Let's talk about how we got here. And it's fairly simple. It's something I think you guys will understand. This is a gentleman named Arthur Brooks. He's out of the United States from something called the Enterprise Institute. He's written lots of books. He's been on Oprah and whatnot. But what he's been quite renowned for is looking into things like relationships between people. So you have couples, and they've done massive studies going back 50, 60 years with tens of thousands of people, and looking at their relationships with one another through their life. They might have met when they were 13, and then interviewing them periodically over the years until they either pass away or get divorced or separated. And in those interviews, they've been able to glean some very strong certainties about identifying whether a couple is not doomed, but fated to end in divorce or separation or breaking up. And a lot of people would think, well, that's because they hate one another or they have different interests or whatever. And in many cases, a lot of times, even though they've divorced, they still deeply love one another and care for one another. But what is usually the telltale sign, the roots of divorce, are in how they treat one another. And that is when one or both of the people in the arrangement, one or both of the parties, treats the other with contempt. So my rhetorical question is, does the rest of Canada treat Alberta with contempt? Now, I would say there are a few people now who have developed an attitude in response to that in Alberta who treat the rest of Canada with contempt. And that's an understandable response, and then it gets worse and worse and worse and worse, and then you're divorced. Now, with a bit of counseling and some effort and some awareness, a lot of these couples, when it was pointed out to them what they were doing, and it can be small things like literally really detesting criticism of how somebody loads the dishwasher, is actually a tell for a future breakup. So once people understand what they're doing, and they adjust their attitudes and see what they're doing, sometimes those relationships can be saved. Many times they aren't. I've asked that question. So what we're getting at here is that, and I suspect most people in this room are very much interested in independence and very much want to see a referendum. Well, a referendum is like a contract. If you're voting for that or voting against it, you're voting on a contract. We don't even know what's in the contract. We don't know what the rest of Canada is prepared to offer, nor are we at all prepared to tell our fellow Albertans what they would be voting for if they voted for independence. But let's get some points we can agree on. First off, I think we can all agree in Alberta, I think we'd get a lot of people vote. A very, very large majority would say that the status quo arrangement of Alberta within the Canadian Confederation is unacceptable. I think we can agree on that. This can't go on, right? We can't put up with this contemptuous treatment, not just verbally, but total disrespect with things like tanker bans and policies clearly designed to take from us as opposed to treat us fairly. So it has to happen. Something has to happen. Either that or we're going to ultimately see this dissolution of Confederation. So we have 4 possible options of what could happen going forward. The first one is that we do change the Constitution to the point that we find it acceptable as Albertans and choose to remain fully within Confederation. The second one is we change the Constitution, but it's not totally equal within, equal, that's not the right term, what I'm talking about, where we'd be the same as all the other provinces, but instead we would have what would be known as a sovereignty association. So we have a lot more aspects of independence, but we would still have links of various forms with the rest of the Canadian Confederation. That's kind of what Quebec has been wanting for 50, 60, 70 years. And then there's what's quite popular in certain circles, certainly in caucus at the provincial level, is what's known as Sovereignty Association Light. And what that is that the federal government will just give us what we're looking for in terms of sovereignty association without requiring any constitutional assurances or contractual arrangements. Very much an ad hoc thing. So we're seeing this, well, if the feds would just guarantee that we'll build pipelines, we'll be okay. I think that falls far short, but there's a ton of people with a lot of power in this province who want that solution because it's essentially the least controversial from their standpoint, certainly in the urban areas. Okay, and then there's the fourth one, of course, is independence. Now, a lot of my discussions, and probably in yours, a lot of guys want to have want immediate statehood to become a state. Just to be clear, that is not going to happen. It can't happen. What we would probably see more likely is economic union with the United States. We'd be an independent entity based on a parliamentary system for now, and then you would have an economic union, essentially currency sharing and open borders economically and whatnot. But statehood just takes too long, and frankly, the politics in the U.S. We would be basically Puerto Rico in terms of status within the U.S. at some point, maybe, and that wouldn't be immediate either. And it would take several years. But certainly if we had independence, ultimately that could end up being statehood at some later date, just not tomorrow. So how big a deal is this? This is a once-in-a-century thing. Not very often you see free countries have referendums swirling around leaving that confederation, that peaceful arrangement. So yeah, it's not like it's going to happen every day of the week. So if it's once in a century, why are we rushing in? I'm not saying we shouldn't do it over the next 24 to 48 or whatever months, but to insist and stamp our feet that it should happen within the next, before the next election, it seems reckless on the face of it. And this is the story. This is a movie. Have you guys ever seen the movie Colors? It's from way back in the day. Robert Duvall and Sean Penn are cops in L.A. back during the riots, if you remember the riots back in the day. And so it's the young, aggressive, go, Sean Penn and the more wizened Bobby Duvall. And they're looking out over the city from up in, I guess, the Palisade Heights, which burnt to the ground. And Mr. Duvall, the cop, tries to explain to the young cop the story of the rooster, the young rooster, and the old rooster. And the story goes, he says, well, there's these guys, these roosters are looking over a hen house, just like we're looking over L.A., and the young rooster says, let's run down there and grab one of those hens and do things. And because I'm on Facebook, I'm trying to keep it PG. And the old rooster says, no, let's just walk down and do them all. So the moral being that let's not rush into this and make a mess of it and scare a whole bunch of people and ultimately not get what our ultimate result is, a far more complete and long enduring answer. So it's in the interest of, and I'm going to argue that it is in the interest of all supporters of all four options, okay, that instead of having a referendum and then dealing with what's this going to look like, we should be pursuing a constitutional convention before that referendum happens. Ideally in the spring of next year would be best, and then a referendum at the earliest, the fall of 2026. Okay, so why would it be good for all sides? Well, if you want to stay in Confederation and we get a successful convention and Alberta gets what it needs and what it wants, then pretty good chance that referendum, if there is one, won't. It'll be a referendum, as Joel pointed out this morning, just now. It'll be a referendum on whether we accept that constitutional agreement, much like the Charlottetown Accord. Remember those days, where we all got to vote on what the deal was. We turned it down. If we got what we needed, we would have voted probably yes for that. So if you want to stay, it makes sense. For those who want sovereign association by a constitutional change, that could be the development that comes out of a constitutional convention. So clearly, if we're going to have constitutional change to create sovereignty association, we have to have it eventually. Why not have it before the referendum? And it's those who want sovereignty association light, again, the same thing might come along where because we have a constitutional convention and it stutters or fails or doesn't go forward, it may scare the federal government into making the concessions that they want. I would argue that probably isn't the case, simply because I think the federal government, unlike how they treated Quebec when their referendums failed, where they threw money at them and let them do what they want with health care and whatever else they wanted, essentially practice sovereignty association without any penalties, the federal government would have a very different attitude if a referendum failed here. I think it would be, how do we dismantle the Alberta economy such that they could never consider doing this ever again? And for those who want independence, well, if we have a convention, and certainly there are a lot of people who are very skeptical, and I totally understand the skepticism, certainly all past experience would indicate that it will not succeed. But a failed constitutional convention pretty much guarantees that the referendum is going to pass. We've tried, we did our best, we were treated with contempt yet again. We were told we couldn't have what we clearly need to carry on in this confederation. All right, guys, we now have an informed option as to what we would be voting to leave. And then the other step would be to ultimately know what we're voting for if we voted to leave. And if the option, very handily, the issues, and this is the big thing. Sorry, I want to go back to this. So, if the independent option loses, and I think it's much more likely to lose as I'm standing here today, without a constitutional convention having a result that's been adverse towards confederation, that referendum is going to be a lost cause. And if we lose, that issue is dead for decades. Joel, the referendum was 95 in Quebec or 96? So we're 30 years. And I have not heard very much at all in Quebec where they're going to renew and have another referendum. At the very least, it's probably 5 years. It might be another 25 years, if at all. Jacques Parizeau, or sorry, not Jacques Parizeau, Lucien Bouchard talked about winning conditions, and I think most Quebecers would agree winning conditions for a referendum do not currently exist in Quebec. So that issue could be dead for decades, long after we're all dead in this room. So we got to make it right. And the dynamic, to go back to the divorce analogy, is that Alberta would be basically the metaphor as a battered wife. You've been treated with contempt, you've been treated poorly, you've been rejected yet again, you go storming out towards the door, and before you leave the door, you turn around and come back. Okay? The feds, personally, I have no pity for that person. You had your choice, you could have left, you didn't go. Whatever happens to you next is on you. And I think the feds would be very much emboldened to do everything in its power to make sure that Alberta was never economically strong enough to choose independence at any time soon. And we talked about winning conditions, so I'll move on. Why Alberta should not wait for the other provinces. I'm told from very good sources that the government of Alberta is already in conversations to call for a constitutional convention with the province of Quebec, Nova Scotia, and Saskatchewan. Quebec has long talked about it. They have some big issues they want to deal with on immigration. I won't get into that. But those four provinces, they're meeting. They want to have a constitutional convention. Well, we can't wait because we need answers to make an informed choice, because we're the only ones who, pretty almost a certainty, we're going to have a referendum in the next 18 months or less. Everybody else hasn't got that timeline. So we can't sit around and wait. I think we have to go forward so we do know what we're voting on. We don't know what we're looking at right now. We don't know what the other provinces are prepared to offer or not offer. So we need to know. Alberta has never initiated a constitutional convention. Alberta has never had a serious conversation about what its needs or wants were. I will differ with Sheane. Alberta was very much into conversations about the Constitution 82, very heavy-duty conversations. There was what was known as the Kitchen Accord, which a guy who headed that was a guy named Jean Chrétien. You might have heard of him. And out of that came the notwithstanding clause that was put in the Constitution at the request of Alberta. And the only non-signatory on the Constitution is, of course, Quebec. René Lévesque was in power there, and there's no way in God's green earth he was going to sign a Constitution. And that's a big issue in Quebec still. So we have to do our due diligence. And frankly, I think Albertans deserve that due diligence as well. They need us to act responsibly. If we're going to sign a contract, we need to do our due diligence. Part of it is saying, okay, what does the current situation, what are they going to offer? What are the guys that we're dealing with going to offer? And our timeline, as I mentioned, is far more urgent. They might see they want changes, but nobody else is anywhere near to having a referendum. We can't wait. And frankly, I think that if we did call for one tomorrow, I think the other provinces that we're already talking with would join in. I also think that the province of Newfoundland would join in. They have things they want. I'll talk a little bit about that in a sec, as will BC and very likely some other provinces as well. Okay, it's also about seizing the initiative. Right now, I don't know if you've noticed, but a lot of people in the rest of Canada think we're somehow evil, that we're mean-spirited, that we're negative, that we're pessimistic, that we have a chip on our shoulder, and some of that's true. By calling for a constitution, by actually saying, look, we want to fix this. We're interested in trying to fix it. That makes us proactive, and it makes us look like we're being pro-Canadian, or at least willing to give it a shot. And we want to fix it. Albertans always want to fix things. That's one of the interesting things. I'm from Newfoundland originally, and I work in insurance, and I always get told by guys in Eastern Canada about Albertan insurance people is, you guys always want more. You guys always want this and that. You want it better. You're years ahead of everybody else and asking for certain things. And I'm going, yeah, because we don't sit still. We don't look at the oil in the ground and say, oh, it wouldn't be nice to get that there. No, we commercialize SAGD for oil sands. We pioneer 3D seismic. We pioneer coiled tubing workovers. We pioneer fracking, right? All those things were commercialized here because we saw an opportunity and we acted and invented to make it happen. Everybody, just as an aside, everybody here has a phone, right? On that phone, what you're looking at when you're looking at your web page is something called Java. Usually it's written in Java. Java was a language that was written in Calgary, right? It was written in Calgary. Why? Because we had a problem in the oil field shipping data over fax lines of 3D seismic down to Calgary to look at it. So they said, well, let's have screenshots. Let's just see the visuals. We won't send the data. I'll just see what the data looks like up there. We won't transport it. So those are the kinds of things Albertans can do and have done in the past. And I think that there's no better situated entity in the world to come up with the greatest constitution on earth and maybe save a country or create a new one. Okay. We're leaders, we're not reactionaries, although there are a lot of people who are very reactionary in this province. Not going to deny that. Sovereignty Association Light is not enough. I won't talk about that too much, but basically this naivety, this assumption that the feds are going to come across and let us build pipelines all of a sudden. Okay? Well, maybe they will, for now, until the next election. Or maybe the NDP gets in Alberta and says, hey, we don't want that, right? We can't be letting our actual future economics to be subject to electoral whims. There needs to be firmer guarantees to do what we need to do outside of a government. It's amazing to me that we're just expecting that the governments should build pipelines. Why? Those are private enterprises. All we need is to provide them the easements. So things like, what are we going to do about the Canada Health Act? There's a lot of talk now about how the feds should move away from health care and and cut the GST or give the GST to the provinces to fund their own health care, which is a respective jurisdiction. Good luck with that. I don't think the feds are anywhere interested in that. Equalization formula. Anybody think that Carney's going to change the equalization formula? I don't think so. So just hoping, the goodwill of Canadians, it hasn't worked out now. Why would we expect it to work out in the future? I don't think it's a permanent fix. I totally think that. So let's talk about a new constitution just to give you some ideas about what that conversation would look like. First off, one of the great fundamental aspects of a great constitution is that it's portable. And what I mean by that is the language of the Constitution should be not focused on, there's two kinds of politics, or two kinds of geography. There's physical geography. We're here in Barrhead. 50 million years from now, this will still be here, okay? But the political climate could very much be changed. So the physical geography never changes. The political geography is always changing. And what you're trying to do with the Constitution is create a rule book for the political geography that ultimately, if that works, it can be applied to any physical geography. The U.S. Constitution, and I'll talk a little bit about the Constitution, doesn't refer to any physical geography. Once you take away the original documents that basically say here are the 13 states that are creating it, and that those are all null and void now because they've been done, the U.S. Constitution nowhere mentions physical geography, okay? And that's what makes it enduring. You could take the U.S. Constitution and put it on Mars, if you're Elon Musk, and it's an operational document. You get my drift? Okay. That's the U.S. Constitution, and that's a good Constitution. It's a great Constitution. It's not perfect, but it's great. It makes no reference to geography. The Canadian Constitution makes reference, the 1982 version, to Quebec 171 times. Right? It's totally tied down. And the problem is political geography and physical geography don't always stay the same. That's a huge issue. Okay, I'll move on from all that. it needs to be if we're going to have a convention, it needs to be a serious event. We've never really had a serious constitution event. It's always been brinkmanship. It's in a hotel ballroom for a couple of days, or it's a resort on a lake near Ottawa named Meech, and it's a couple days, and everybody's plastered on cocktails and wine, and it's basically 9 premiers are true rookies, and you got a guy who was a union negotiator in Mulroney, and you got Robert Bourassa, who'd been thinking about these constitutional things pretty much all his adult life, and he played them for suckers, got Distinct Society and a whole bunch of things written in there. Absolute disaster. And that was what motivated me to get into politics, was what a travesty the Meech Lake Accord was, and working with Clyde Wells and others to cause its demise. So we need to have a serious one. It can't be just 10 days. It needs to be what we had. And oh, by the way, there's the graphics there. This is the event after it had been done. That guy's a rookie. That's Getty. I can't see him quite from here. That's Peckford, I think. Anyway, all those guys are first-term premiers, except for the guy conspicuously in a different colored suit, Robert Bourassa. Anyway, that's not how you write a constitution that's going to stand up for 300 or 250 years or 3,000 years. And there's Meech Lake dying. That was the day after, actually, Clyde Wells refused to have the vote. I was in the room behind the curtain when that was all going down. Very, very tumultuous. Serious event. So we need to do, my suggestion is, and I think most people who've thought about this, we need to do what the U.S. did. And the U.S. they went from May till September 1787 to create the Constitution in a small courthouse now known as Constitution Hall. Sat in this room through the summer in Philadelphia with the windows closed and the curtains drawn so nobody could look in, and they're all in powdered wigs and heavy suits for 5 months. And they hashed it out. It was as vicious and hard-nosed as you can imagine. I don't know what kind of swear words they said back then. They probably did "thoust" or something or whatever. But it became what is known as the miracle at Philadelphia. And the crux of the matter is the same crux of the matter, in my opinion, that exists in Canada, except they solved theirs. Theirs is known, if you Google it, the Great Compromise. Canadians always talk about how we're such accommodating and compromising people. The United States was based on a compromise that Canada still can't come to, and that is giving equal representation at the Senate for each of the provinces, because that's what we have that's what they have in the U.S. And that's what, without that, there is no United States. Okay. The other goal we should have is that it's the best in the world. We're one of the few nations that, if this ever came to be in fruition, either Alberta on its own or Canada with a repaired constitution, where we would have, if we're going to do this, let's make it the best constitution, not just a constitution. Let's design what we've got. Lots of other constitutions we can work with, the U.S. Constitution, others. Let's pull from the best and make a best of the best and make it the template for nations going forward. And we have that ability. I think Albertans have that ability. I think a lot of Canadians do as well. And frankly, we owe it to our citizens to go there. Okay, I'm going to go real quick. These are the 4 things that we think at Libertas we have to have, or let's fire up the independence vehicle and get out of Dodge. First one, as we've mentioned, equal representation at the Senate. Absolutely critical. It's right now we're suffering under the tyranny of the majority. The House of Commons is running our show because they can. And we need to reform the Senate so the provinces that aren't the most populous can stand up and push back against the most populous ones. It's just going to fail. If we don't get that, ultimately we're going to fail. And there's 2 things, and this is something a lot of people provincially especially go, well, if we give the Senate those kinds of powers, that equality, and they have the power or start to exercise it, we make the premiers and the provinces weaker. That's flat out not the case. The primary role of the Senate is to protect the interests of the province in relation to federal jurisdiction. Okay? The provinces have no power to affect federal jurisdiction because they have no representation. So we need that role filled by the Senate. And the second one is, and maybe even more importantly, it's a throttle on the federal government from interfering in provincial jurisdiction, right? If we had an equal Senate, there is no Canada Health Act, okay? There's no national pharmacare, there's no national daycare. That just doesn't happen because those provinces aren't going to allow it. Frankly, if we don't get that, why bother? We're done. It's why Meech failed. It's why Charlottetown failed, and it's why this convention would fail if we don't get that resolved. And it's up to the provinces of Ontario and Quebec to essentially agree to it. That's the big one. Number two, we need to have rules that will not. Right now, there's federal jurisdiction, provincial jurisdiction in our Constitution, but clearly the feds are paying absolutely no attention to that. They're using their taxing power to use money to get provinces to do what they want those provinces to do in areas of provincial jurisdiction. We're seeing it with daycare right now, where we're already seeing if you want federal daycare dollars, you have to have the right kind of entrance to your daycare, that you have to have the right level of training. Guess what? It'll be a federally accredited course that'll be run by federal bureaucrats, and on it goes. Same thing with the Canada Health Act. We need in the Constitution explicit wording and legal backing to prevent the feds from interfering in areas of provincial jurisdiction, and vice versa. Not that that ever happens. And I think we can all agree that's probably the biggest irritant we have, is that the federal government is interfering in what we want to do. And so we need something in the Constitution to deal with that. Number three, equality for all Canadians under the law. I always loved it when, not loved it, but Justin Trudeau would talk about how the United States had institutionalized racism. Yet we have a thing called the Indian Act in Canada. It's right there. It's written down. Indian Act. It's institutionalized racism. We need to end that stuff. All Canadians should be equal. Period. It seems fundamental, but it's amazing how many people who talk about equality are all for the Indian Act. Can't imagine it ever being taken away. It's like people who say, we hate slavery, but the Emancipation Proclamation was a disaster. No, it wasn't. It's what freed the friggin' slaves in the United States. Did people die? Were there riots? Yeah. But would you rather we still have slavery in the U.S.? Unbelievable. And in the U.S., if you're interested, it's the 14th Amendment. It's a very lengthy document. It talks about prior restraint and all kinds of stuff. I highly recommend you read it because it's something that's completely lacking in our Constitution. And the fourth one, of course, and it's probably pretty dear up here as it is in most of Alberta and frankly elsewhere, property rights. Under the current Canadian Constitution, you have no property rights. It's only said 4 times in the Constitution that it's in relation to provincial property versus federal property. Everything, if you think you own the land you're on, you don't own it. You're just, the Crown is letting you use it with your name on it. We need to have much stronger property rights. That includes gun rights and all those things and our ability to use that property how we see fit. I don't think I need to preach on that too much to this audience. Real quick, some other things. What does it require to be a province? I think this is a big issue and a big trading point, frankly. We talked about physical geography. Shouldn't provinces be somewhat relative to one another in terms of population? If you fall below 1% of the Canadian population, should you really stay as a province? PEI is 0.13% of population of the rest of Canada. You've got 130,000 people versus what's Ontario now? 14 million people, right? At some point PEI might have been big a long time ago. It's not anymore, okay? I was looking at the population trends. In about 85 years, Yukon's going to be bigger than PEI, okay? Especially if the demographics and PEI continue to erode as they get older and older and older. So maybe we should have a mechanism that causes that province to become a territory. It has to become part of another province. I think that's a big selling point for for Ontario and Quebec especially, but also us. Also, provinces should be able to subdivide. And that's one of the big flaws in the U.S. Constitution. Again, political geography changes. There was a time when New York State, as it currently looks, made sense because everything was up and down the Hudson River to Lake Erie and the canals that were ultimately built. I can tell you right now, the 5 boroughs of New York politically are very different than the northern New York State. But northern New York State cannot separate unless all of New York State allows it to. Same thing in California. If you guys have been in California, I think you can attest that interior California is very different than the strip along the Pacific, and they would very much like to become a state, but the strip along the Pacific has enough population to prevent that from happening. We need to allow provinces, if you can organize yourself as a piece of physical geography with enough people, let's say 5% of the population of Canada, and you want to become a province, go for it. And so let's say the first one that would ever, if this rule existed, the first place that would do that would be the island of Montreal, would instantly want to become its own province away from the rest of Quebec. That would be almost overnight. And then the city of Toronto would probably want to do something like that. Maybe the interior of BC would want to be separate from the lower mainland, etc. So that's just items for discussion. The laundry list, if you will. Appointing judges. So you mentioned a little bit about judge appointments. The only person who has the power to appoint a judge is the Prime Minister. So how's that working for us? Okay, we need to have a much more involved process and a much more open process as to who gets to be a Supreme Court judge and other lower circuit judges as well. Term limits on judges and senators and people in the House of Commons. One of my great fears is one day genetics are going to get strong enough and medical science are going to get strong enough that you'll have a Supreme Court judge in the United States with the politics of a Ruth Bader Ginsburg or a Sotomayor, and we just have her brain in a jar and she's voting. And we keep her alive indefinitely. We don't have term limits, lifetime appointments. I'm an insurance guy, just real quick. This is a good piece of trivia next time we're at a barbecue. Insurance companies right now consider, if you're a newborn child in Canada, your average life expectancy is expected to be 106 years. Right? The average age of all Canadians is age 82 or 3 or something like that. But newborns, it's 106. And God knows what it'll be 106 years from now. Specific language regarding equalization right now, it just says there should be equalization. There needs to be more stronger wording about how do we calculate provincial revenues. We should be discounting for provinces that spend more than others. Right now, there's an incentive to spend more because you might get more equalization. And there's an incentive to report less in terms of earnings, so you get more equalization. Everybody points fingers at Quebec Hydro and selling power for below market prices. Probably the worst offender is Manitoba Power. They've just turned it into a giant make-work project. Rather than show earnings, they hire more people. If you look at their annual report for every year for the last however many years, all they talk about is how many more people they hired. Because if they show revenues, it goes against equalization. So don't think it's just a Quebec or Eastern Canadian thing. There's people west of Ontario who are gaming this system too. And BC Hydro too, by the way. Immigration. I think that's a big issue. Would you not agree? That you have the federal government doing whatever it wants in terms of immigration, causing enormous stresses and impacts on areas of provincial jurisdiction, healthcare, law enforcement, all those things, housing, that's all provincial jurisdiction. Yet the feds have complete control over the keys as to how many people get in the door. That needs to stop. So we need to have some kind of provincial backstop or authorization, if you will, to how many people come in. And clearly there's a political objective, just like there was in the U.S., a mistaken one, that if we let all these illegal immigrants in, they'll ultimately change and vote Democratic when they become legal some way or another. That's not working out very well for them. Almost done. Banking and insurance, I would argue that that's one of the biggest limitations to our productivity in Canada is how bad our banking and insurance is. Banking has not been changed. The Bank Act has not truly been seriously changed since 1926. I think you would agree that the banking system is a lot more different and sophisticated. I have a friend of mine who's used to be a banker for TD. He was a currency trader in the 60s. And his buddies in Toronto, one of his friends had this military phone line to London, right? So they didn't have to pay long distance charges. So they had a line right to downtown London, and they would arbitrage the British pound against the Canadian dollar because nobody else had that kind of access. That's how small the bandwidth was for information. But he said a big day for us in arbitrage was $40 million a day. $40 million gets traded every half a nanosecond now, something like that. Like, the technology's changed it. We've got a banking act that was based on a hinterland economy at a time when Alberta maybe had 150 to 200,000 people. That we need to take that. And insurance has similar issues. Offshore rights. We don't have we don't have much tidewater in Alberta. Certainly matters a lot to us, but offshore rights is a massive issue for Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and BC. The fact that they don't own the seafloor, it's federal. Yet if Newfoundland left, that seafloor doesn't stay with Canada. It should be. It was a terrible mistake in Confederation of '49 to strip the province of that ownership. BC, of course, would have similar interests because of the resources potential off of Pacific coastline. So a lot more enforceable terms. The federal government actually has not just responsibility, but the duty to make sure that if we're a province and we want to get product to a jurisdiction that's a province or more away, the federal government has to facilitate that transport. That's what Confederation was originally set up to be, was to provide an east-west logistical corridor. And the federal government was given the responsibility to make sure that happened. And they're not doing it. We didn't, why aren't all these pipelines being built the Pacific Tidewater that were scheduled? Because the feds didn't live up to their responsibilities, and the provinces, and the province of Alberta, in the Constitution, has no legal recourse to force them. So we need to fix the Constitution for that as well. We need to have the legal power to force the other provinces and the federal government to facilitate those pieces of logistics. By the way, everybody talks about Hudson Bay and Eastern Canada. Forget about it. The real money's in the Pacific, not in the Atlantic. I think that's a sideshow, and we should really move away from that. So in sum, we don't have the answers. We need the answers. We need to know what we're looking at if we're considering leaving and creating our own country. It was pointed out at a session I was at on Saturday that Quebec in 1990, prior to the 95 referendum, commissioned a study as to what sovereignty association would look like. A very lengthy document that looked at all the parameters and pros and cons. There was some stuff I didn't agree with in there. But the province of Alberta not only should be calling for a constitutional convention, it should be initiating, okay, if we did vote for independence, what does that look like? If we did have sovereignty association, what does that look like? Pros and cons and opinions and whatnot. But we should be, it's our provincial government's duty on our behalf to practice its due diligence, not just on the constitutional convention side, but also on what is it we would be voting for if we did vote for independence. Because it's an informed decision. We have a duty to mitigate. We have an obligation to make reasonable efforts to limit the harm. And I think that's only reasonable. And that's all I got. So I guess we open it up for questions now.
My proposition is that each of you gives just a couple more minutes of remarks, and then we'll get into the questions. So go ahead.
Well, I'm not sure exactly what to add to it, except that Gord's right. I was wrong. I don't admit that very often, because I did my notes so quickly I forgot to put in the Kitchen Act. But yes, so with that, I'll give it to Joel.
I don't see a reason to draw things out any further on my account. So, Gord, you want?
Sure. I've never met a microphone I didn't like. The only thing I would say, just to give you some background on me, just a tiny bit, is My standpoint I share with Lauren Gunter and others who writes for the National Post, and that is I'm for independence, but not necessarily independence. So independence if necessary, but not necessarily independence. I think we have to go down this pathway. It's like any relationship. You know, if you're in marital troubles and you've got kids, and we have kids, we have fellow Albertans and we have fellow Canadians who aren't able to vote, and it's our duty, our responsibility to make the best effort to cause them the least amount of harm and least amount of emotional duress. But failing that, if that's not going to work, then we have to do in an orderly and peaceful manner become independent of one another, or have a different relationship where I guess sovereignty association would be similar to having custodial rights with the kids. The kids are at the house one week and they're at the ex's house the next week, that kind of a thing. But I think that's the approach, that's the metaphor, if you will, as to what we need to go going forward. But I think the other thing, a lot of people in Western Canada, in Alberta, still don't grasp is that a lot of people in the rest of Canada have no idea how pissed off we are. No clue. And if they do find out about it, their initial reaction is, how could you be so un-Canadian? How could, you guys are clowns, right? You guys are just a bunch of cranks. You think you make money? What are you talking about, right? The understanding, and I'm from Newfoundland originally, but I lived in Ontario, lived in BC. My mom's from Ontario. She was a United Empire loyalist, if you know what that is. In that part of Canada, a lot of them think that they are the core of Canada. Pierre Trudeau, after the Kitchen Accord, was asked about what was going on to respond to a comment by Joe Clark. Everybody remember that goof? Anyway. Clark did say at the time he saw Canada as a string of 10 pearls of equal size. And they took that quote to Pierre Trudeau, and he said, I see Canada as a gold chain with 2 diamonds in the middle. And I think that's it. There's a lot of people in this country who have that perspective to this day, that this country fundamentally is Ontario and Quebec, and the rest of us are just visitors. Very much so. That's something we need to be prepared to and be prepared to push back against.
I'd actually further to that, I do have some contacts in the East, and they really have no idea. And that's part of the struggle, is trying to wake this country up to what's going on. And so far, that's been very, very hard to do. Like, why are you guys so mad? You should be happy. We're the greatest country on earth. I said, well, do you know about political representation in this country at the federal level? Let's talk. Anyhow, go on.
Okay, we're actually going to do the first question from Max.
I just want to double check with you guys if you can expand on Bill C5 and how is it that it's so dangerous?
I'll give you the Coles Notes version on it. I haven't had a chance to go through it entirely, but the scary part of it is that it proposes to allow the federal government, i.e. the cabinet, to set aside any Canadian law they see fit. Now that's supposedly for economic purposes, but we just watched the federal police force run literally roughshod over little old ladies. I don't for a second believe it'll be confined to that. It may start that way, but it'll grow. We need a country that's ruled by law, the rule of law, not whatever this is. But I'll leave it there. Like I say, I haven't had a chance to read the whole bill yet.
I actually read it this afternoon before I left, but like I said, it is still just tabled, not introduced, which is a huge difference. And everything that Joel said is true. They can, by an order in council, which is just the cabinet, they would be able to set aside any Canadian law according to it. But, like I said, it's just been tabled at this point. So until it is actually introduced into the House, I'm not going to panic over it.
I don't know if I'd use the word panic either. However, there's a gentleman, I guess, I don't even like to use that term, a guy named Barack Obama, and I'm sure other guys said similar things. He had Rahm Emanuel was one of his advisors, and he always said, never let a crisis go to waste. And what you're seeing now is the Carney government saying, oh, there's a crisis in Canada. We can't get pipelines built, right? Ideal, so Ontario's going, yeah, we need to do something to placate Alberta. So under that auspices, well, we need more powers, and everybody's talking about we need interprovincial free trade, right? So that's another crisis. So rather than exercise the powers the federal government already has to build pipelines, he doesn't need any more powers. He's got all the powers he needs. He just doesn't want to be the person. Like, they could have fined the BC government $1 billion a week if they wanted to for not getting the pipeline built down to Vancouver. They went a different way, obviously. They nationalized it, right? Classic liberal tactic. So they're using that crisis, those two crises that look very politically palatable to a lot of Canadians, to grab more power, right? Now, what do you think the odds are if you give a progressive politician more power? What are they likely to do with it? They're likely to friggin' abuse it. So hopefully there's some pushback on it, but they're looking for carte blanche under a Trojan horse that they're saying, we're doing this on your behalf, Alberta. How could you possibly be complaining about that? So.
Okay, we have another question here. Imperative for separation can't wait 4 years. The reality on the ground is changing too quickly. Economic deterioration, immigration, etc. World Economic Forum agenda at play. How do you fast track? How do you fast track, I think, separation, independence? I believe that's the question.
You don't. The process, even if we moved as quickly as possible, the process will take a while. You're looking at 18 months to 2 years. But the problem is, if we do try and fast track it, we'll lose. And if you think things are bad on the ground now, wait until Ottawa realizes they can do whatever they want to Alberta. That's what the loss will indicate to Ottawa. They won't start pandering to us like they did Quebec. They will just take full advantage of the fact that Alberta has said yes. Yes to all this institutional unfairness, to the fact that we are a colony of the East. Yes, we accept that. Yes, we stay. They'd have a field day with it. And that's why I'm an advocate for taking this very slowly and methodically. Now, I say very slowly. I don't mean a decade. I mean 5 years or less. But if we go running into this thing too quickly, we're going to end up in a much, much worse place than we are now.
I would 100% agree with Joel on that again. Because if we rush into it, as he said, we will fail. We don't have the numbers, and if we don't have the numbers and we fail, Ottawa already thinks that they can just about do anything they want. Well, they will be able to do it afterwards. They won't care about the Constitution. They have already set aside the Constitution when it fits them. They will just basically throw it out the window. And there were things about the Alberta Act that I didn't even bring up. Like, right in the Alberta Act, it gives them, based upon what Joel was talking about senators and elected representatives, our formulation was supposed to be like the Northwest Territories, and that has never actually changed. we were given provincialhood, but we were treated as if we were a territory. And that has never changed. And if we fail with this referendum, it will go right back to that. We will just be treated as if we are their territory.
I see a referendum like any decision. Of course, being an insurance guy, this shouldn't surprise anybody. I see it as a sale, okay? And this is a big, giant sit. We're going to sit down, and how am I going to, if you're into independence, how am I going to convince the customer on the other side of the table that this is the right way forward? You know how you do that? And I've been in, 10,000 sales meetings? Probably. Scares me to say it. And the number one objective is to address all the objections that the prospect has in a sane, calm, yet serious manner, to the extent that objection has been addressed and they're okay with what you've explained. If you don't, all it takes is one. There's an old adage in sales: you stop trying to sell when you agree with what the guy's objection is. Oh, I need to talk to my wife first. Pretty hard to come over that one, right? If they say, well, you haven't even asked the federal government and the rest of the provinces what they have to offer. That's a good objection. We should go find out what that is. Or, you guys want independence, so what does that mean? What kind of government we're going to have? How are we going to do it? What's the mechanisms? How's our banking system going to work? How are you going to treat my pension? How are you going to treat my occupational health and safety at work? What's the minimum wage going to be? How are we adopting all that? What's the process? We haven't done any of those things. And if you just try and push somebody into a sale, and I'm looking at the guy who probably wrote the question, I'm guessing if I tried to flog an F-250 on you and never told you what the price was and never told you what the options were and what was out there, you're not going to friggin' buy, right? So why would you just say, damn it, we shouldn't be here, it's a ruination, these people are nuts not to vote for it, let's just have a referendum and I'll be right even though we lose and go down in flames. That's not the way you close a sale, and we'll end up, to use the metaphor one step further, a lot poorer if we do that. We need to be calm, take our time, be deliberative, explain to everybody. Look at what happened to the Alberta pension plan. We didn't do that. There were some people in the Premier's office who wanted to rush through, totally rushed into the thing, had no game plan to market it, treated it like we're just going to do it. Well, yeah, how did that work out? You had a whole bunch of people scared of Jesus out of people about what their pension was going to be, that it was a total scam, that we were going to invest it in oil and gas and piss it all away, and on and on. We didn't do that. I have a great PowerPoint for APP on Libertas' site, by the way. So yeah, it's a sale. We have to take our time with this. Is it going to take 10 years? No, but it might take 2, maybe 3. I think if we call for a constitutional convention today and demand that it happen, not demand, I think we'd reasonably expect by a year from now the convention would proceed for 3 months, and after 3 months in the fall of 2026 we would have a referendum on whatever came out of that constitutional convention. Anyway, thanks.
Yeah, I just want to say thanks for your presentations, and Gord, that's probably the most intelligent and level-headed approach that I've seen to this topic. I love it. I think we have an amazing opportunity in Alberta right now, once in a lifetime, and I'm worried we're going to blow it by rushing it, like you guys are saying. Question I have is, well, I have a couple actually. One is, what is any kind of leverage that we might have in actually getting some constitutional changes that you guys are talking about? Because I can't see the feds just saying, yeah, sure, let's just give you guys this Christmas list and make peace. And the other question is what are the chances that you guys think that Danielle Smith will put this to a referendum to shut us all up and move on? I don't know if I 100% trust her, and I like her quite a bit, but she's a politician. I don't know if I trust her.
For the first question, I think the referendum really is the leverage. I wouldn't want to go into a constitutional negotiation after one. I want to do it before. No, the referendum after the constitutional conference. The referendum hovering in the background will help hone some minds in the East. And they'll have to decide how valuable is Alberta to us, because the consequence will be pretty clear. As for the second question, I believe what she says. I know her very well. And if she says she's not going to do it, she's not going to do it. She said that it's a matter for a citizen-initiated referendum. If people want it, it'll go through, but she's not going to initiate anything.
I'll stay totally away from the second part, second question. On the first part of the question, it's exactly right. But one thing I would add is you were saying that Ottawa, if we go to a constitutional convention, it's not just Ottawa, it's all the other provinces too. And a lot of the provinces will still want us, even if Ottawa doesn't. So we have that leverage when we go to that type of meeting. If we're dealing with Ottawa one-on-one, they may not care if we leave. But some of the other provinces would care if we go. So that gives us a little bit of leverage right there on that as well.
I'm going to tell us, I'm all about stories, but Danielle is part of a caucus. And there's also the Premier's office and the people inside that Premier's office. Joel knows there are certain individuals, and there are individuals in there who have a lot of sway with Danielle and caucus in general. I think if let's be frank, the UCP probably is 65% pro-independence, probably maybe even more than that. That is an enormous threat to a future election. Because if we divide, if we became an independence party, we get slaughtered in the next election. Slaughtered. And you've got the NDP for the next 8 to 10 years. The last thing we want to do is divide the conservative side of the equation over a question of independence, which should not be right or left. It's in or out, if you know what I'm saying. I think there are people who are NDP could see a lot of benefits to having independence. We need to talk to everybody, not just our own circle. So the story I have is I talked about the Miracle of Philadelphia. I highly recommend that book I put up there. So this is how it went down in the U.S. May 1887, all the states, kind of the 13 states were in and out meeting and whatnot. And they're solving all kinds of stuff, property rights and how banking's going to work and all these things. But there's the big issue. And right from the get-go, they knew it was a big issue, and they kept avoiding it, and it would come up and people would stay away because it was too hot an issue. And the issue was, in England, they had the House of Commons, which was the common people, representation by population, and the House of Lords, which were the gentry, the earls and dukes and all that stuff. Well, the Americans weren't going to have that. That's what they fought the revolution over, right? They wanted to be more like what the French wanted, like egalitarianism, where everybody was an equal. But what was that? And they wanted it to be a house of sort of second thought, sober thought. And the small states, the small future states, wanted it to be equal, right? Each state had 2 senators and equal powers and the bigger states, the Ontarios and Quebecs, back then it was New York and New Jersey, and those states, and Virginia, were big states, and they didn't want it. And every time it would come around, it would get really heated because the big states are going, you guys aren't, why are we wasting our time with you guys? You're only tiny states, right? Lecturing Connecticut on being too small and all this kind of stuff. So it became very, very touchy. It finally came to a crescendo in August. And one of the large states, I think it was New Jersey, said, okay, let's do this. Let's have a vote to create the House of Commons, the Congress. and we'll have it rep by pop, and then we'll have a vote on the Senate with equal representation by the states. And the small states took that to be, okay, you guys are going to support that motion. Cool. So they vote for the first one, passes unanimously. Comes up to the second vote, the big states voted down, essentially double-crossed the smaller states. And the small state reps got up and were furious, said nasty things, and started walking out the door. And it was like a courthouse with a little swing gate, right? Just before you go out, if you've ever been in a courthouse. And right at the gate was a guy you've heard of named Benjamin Franklin, who at the time was almost 80 years of age, riddled with gout in a wheelchair. And he literally wheeled his wheelchair in front of the gate so the guys couldn't get out, and made an impassioned plea to the big states and said, we have fellow people of the colonies who have fought and died to create this country, and you're going to throw it away on this. You're going all those lives that were lost, all of your family members and friends who died, fought for this, and you're going to throw it away on this. And that was what became known as the Great Compromise, because they went back and they voted and they created the Senate. I think that if we have a Constitutional Convention, it goes on for months, that issue, same issue, is going to be the issue. And if that issue isn't resolved and the Constitution Convention ends and it isn't resolved, and Alberta has a referendum literally probably 6 months away scheduled, there's going to be a lot of get back into that room. A lot of people in Ontario and elsewhere saying, do you think you can do game theory? Just I'm prattling on, but so Quebec, the convention's going to fail on that issue and other issues, okay? And we're leaving. Guess who's coming with us? Saskatchewan, for sure. Probably the interior BC, and frankly, the coast of BC could care less about Canada now. If you go down to Vancouver, they're not focused on the rest of Canada. Burnaby is 75% visible minorities. They're not the minority anymore. Do you think they think about Quebec and distinct society? Not a chance, right? Their societies are 5,000 and 10,000 years old, not 300, right? And they're focused on the Pacific. They could care less about Quebec. So now you're Ontario. You got Manitoba, which frankly is a basket case fiscally, hopelessly badly run. You've got a Atlantic Canada, which is literally dying out. And you've got Quebec, which is a complete train wreck politically. And you're Ontario. Do you want to be stuck with those clowns? Right? Do you think you're going to sit there and let Quebec tear this all up? Ontario takes a ton of pride about being the keystone province, right? The middle, what holds the whole arch of the Confederation together. If they see this going down the pike because Quebec is intransigent, look out. I think Ontario reads in the Riot Act, just like Benjamin Franklin reads the Riot Act to the big states, and I think we got a good shot at maybe fixing that issue. If not, we go out and a referendum happens. Anyway. It's a good story. It's a good story. Even more amazing that it's actually true.
And by the way, I didn't want you to think that I was just sidestepping that second question for the sake of sidestepping it. I like how Gord did it, but we both sit on boards that we can't comment on some of that stuff. Yeah.
I'm free to see whatever I want.
You are, yes.
Okay, next question. Do you see Premier Daniel Smith initiating a constitutional convention? What would it take to motivate Premier Daniel Smith to initiate a constitutional convention? And if so, what would the timeline be for the initiation of it and the occurrence of it, whether you're an optimist or a pessimist?
Is she? Yes, I believe she is. How do you push her? Write her a letter. Call into her radio show. But the best way is writing a letter. When I worked in the legislature, part of my job was being in charge of the correspondence in my ministry. And phone calls, we ignore them. We'll take it, we'll listen. Yeah, thanks very much. Click, forgotten it already. An email will get a reply. It may take a while, it may be a boilerplate, but it'll get a reply. Now, a letter indicates something more. Someone has taken the time not just to write the letter, but to print it, stick it in an envelope, get a stamp for it, and drop it in a letterbox. So I always put way more weight on physical letters than I did on emails. It would also be a good idea to encourage others to do the same. And numbers is what you're looking for if you want to influence something like that. Now, what was the last point?
What would the timeline be, whether you were an optimist or a pessimist? So pretend you're an optimist. What would the timeline be, and then otherwise?
I would expect it would probably take a year before it would happen. I think that's reasonable. Because first we have to convince everybody to do it. Then we have to plan where we're going to do it and how we're going to do it, and what the rules are going to be, and so on and so forth. So I would expect it would take about a year.
So let's just clarify that. Let's say there was a letter writing campaign and it was launched in the next few months, and then Daniel Smith by September received a ton of letters saying, hey, there needs to be a constitutional convention before the referendum. Then you're saying a year after Daniel Smith accepts that decision and decides to initiate a constitutional convention, a year after that, the constitutional convention would actually occur. Is that your proposed timeline?
I think that's fairly realistic. It could happen faster, but let's face it, we're working at the speed of government. So even 1 year might be optimistic.
I would agree with everything that Joel said. One thing that I would say is that when you are writing your letter, include your MLA, send it to your MLA as well, because they represent you, and if enough people from a constituency, a good MLA, not saying that there's a lot of them, but a good MLA will get behind what his constituents are telling him. Not only, even if he's not the most for the people, by the people, he wants to get elected the next time. So if you have a good turnout of letters to him, it's going to help as well, because he can also talk to the Premier and put his 2 cents in.
Now, just a follow-up for you, just a moment here. You're associated with various groups. So, for example, there's Alberta Prosperity Project, who's pushing for the referendum. What if the leaders of Alberta Prosperity Project could be persuaded to realize that a constitutional convention to occur before the referendum is beneficial, and then Alberta Prosperity Project reached out to 250,000 people who signed up on their website and motivated them to write letters to the Premier, the MLAs? What's your thought on that?
My personal thought on that is it's a great idea, but I am not going to speak for Mitch or the Alberta Prosperity Project. But I would suggest that you reach out to them, or anybody else reach out to them with that idea. And then we'll see what they do in consideration of that.
Well, they do have 250,000 people on their list, and probably more by now. Remember, though, that the second part of the question, was influencing the Premier to initiate a constitutional convention. Now, you're involved in UCP policy. And as of June 30th, members of the United Conservative Party can submit resolutions for consideration at the AGM in November. What is your thought if one or more members, or even a board, put forward something that stated the government of Alberta needs to initiate a constitutional convention? What are your thoughts on that?
I'm going to let Gord. He's also on there.
Go for it. I think it's definitely something to put out there. I've been told that Danielle intends to read every single policy and governance resolution that is submitted. That is her goal. In terms of influencing, Joel is absolutely right. There's nothing more powerful than a letter If you're not a good handwriter, print it, but sign it, CC it to your MLA. I believe Jason Steffen is also in charge of that constitutional thing, so you'd CC him. When I say CC, that means another letter, another stamp with a copy of the letter sent to that person, okay? If you had 5,000 people do that, they're going to be talking about it at the next caucus meeting. If you had 10 or 20,000 people do it, Danielle Smith is in front of a microphone talking about it. Seriously, I think that if there was that much determined response that, yes, we're in favor of a referendum to clear the air on this issue, but first we want to have full due diligence in terms of, I'm not going to write the resolution, but due diligence in terms of having a constitutional convention and a proper, thoughtful process by the province to look at what independence would look like as well. You see how I'm addressing both sides of the discussion. A letter to that effect, with, in your own words, don't use ChatGPT, although it is terrific. Or use it to help it to edit your own words, if you know what I mean. Put your own thoughts in your own language down and let ChatGPT freshen up a few things. But if you did that, if you like Joel said, if you had 5,000, they're already, lights are up. But if you had 10,000 plus handwritten letters coming in, they would be quaking in their boots, don't you think, Joel? It would be the biggest mailing campaign in probably the last 50 years in Alberta, seriously.
Oh yeah, you'd have minister staffers running around tearing their hair out.
Can you say that again, Joel, but on the microphone?
Or you'd have minister staffers running around tearing their hair out. That volume of letters to deal with.
I'll touch on the policy thing. One of the things that I'm not going to write your policy for you, and I'm not going to tell you what to write. But I will say that every member of the party has a right to voice their concerns and to write a resolution that they feel compelled to do so. And theirs will be taken seriously no matter what they write. There, I said it in a way that was politically correct.
No. Just give me one more thing. And I'll be reading them because I read every one of them and adjudicate them. The other thing, too, is if you are members of a board, the UCP board, and you as a board want to put forward a motion and refer it to provincial council to refer on to the premier and caucus, that you think it wise to in front of a constitutional in front of a referendum of constitutional convention. Timeline, I never answered that one. I think it all rotates around and pivots around the next election, which is May 2027, right? So it has to all, the referendum, generally speaking, they don't want it real close to the election. They want it in the fall of that year at the latest. So that means the Constitutional Convention, if it's going to happen, needs to happen in the spring, let's say May to July, something like that. So obviously the sooner the better. In terms of how much prep work is required, they've been in discussions with those three other provinces for quite some time now. So they may have a lot of the groundwork in terms of what it would look like already. And the other thing is Danielle can put a line in the sand in terms of timeline with the federal government and the other provinces saying, I've got a referendum happening in October. If you guys drag your feet, we're going to go into that referendum. We're going to say, well, they didn't even respond to our request. So they're going to be under the gun to address that issue. I had somebody was at an event in Red Deer on Saturday, and they said, well, they're never going to they're not going to acknowledge it. We're going to ask and they're going to say no. And I said, well, if they say no, what do we say to them? See ya, right? Just so you know, in the Constitution, a province has the right to ask for a constitutional convention. It's right in there. And if we get flat out cold, no, we're not doing it. Well, okay, we got our answer then, don't we? Right? Doors been slammed in our face. Let's have the referendum. Right? Well, we did because we got the answer from the rest of the country, didn't we? And we're at 35 right now. One thing, we talked about this, it's well and good to be in Barrhead. No, don't get me wrong. But the real battle is in the urban centers. And the real battle is with first and second generation Canadians in those areas, many of whom, a lot of people don't understand this, are totally okay with not being part of Canada. They're the least emotionally attached to the idea of Canada. The polling is crazy on it, like 45, 50% of people under 35 years of age in those centers, when asked, does it matter if we're in Canada or the United States, they go, oh, it doesn't matter to me. I'm good with it, right? So...
Okay, so just a note, Patrick Mullan is watching and he wants to say hi to Gord Tulk. Okay, perfect. We have another question here. At present, the federal election is decided by the time it reaches Manitoba. How can we change Confederation fairly? There's mention here of the proverbial cow getting milked in the East. So to transcribe this question, if, let's say we do get to that constitutional convention and we're discussing some new terms, new proposed terms, Confederation is basically, the election is decided by the time it reaches Manitoba. So what's one of the changes you would propose so that Confederation was fair?
Starting with the lower house, with the House of Commons, I think it's important that the representation be proportional between each and every province. No more 4 MPs for Little PEI. No more 10 or 11 for Nova Scotia. No, if the standard is for 1 MP for every 134,000 people as it is in Alberta, then that's how it has to be across the country. The next step is, of course, the Senate. And we'll go back to Triple E. We've been pushing that for a long, long time. Equal number of senators for each province. It's elected and effective. No longer just editing bills from the House of Commons, but an actual Senate that's, that can be used to introduce bills. Well, it can now, but it's very rare. But an active Senate, much more like the United States Senate. We also need to consider how our judges are appointed, how our lieutenant governors and governor general are appointed, or if they're appointed. Maybe it needs to be an elected office. Judges. All of these things are things that can go towards making it a much more even playing field. What the answer is, I don't know exactly, but certainly more democracy is going to be the direction we have to go.
What a lot of people don't realize, that if the current trends in population go as they are going now, by 2035, Alberta will have a higher population than Quebec, and they do not want that. But that is what has to be one of our demands, is that we have equal representation by true population, not by this jerry-rig system that we have now. Because Alberta will, at the current rate, Alberta, even when we take and have a higher population than Quebec, we will still have significantly less seats than they do, which doesn't make any sense.
First one, it's just a misconception that Eastern Canada decides and we don't, in the sense that their polls get counted sooner. We can't stop the sun. We have time zones. We wouldn't expect people to open the polls in Newfoundland at 4 a.m. and close them at noon, and then we open our polls at whatever time to coordinate so everybody closes at the same time. That's just not workable. Just because now, what we could do is mandate that no polls are counted until a certain time. I think that's a simple piece of legislation. There's been a lot of work done. We already have staggered voting now in terms of time zones to somewhat address the issue, and it's more optics than actuality, if you know what I'm saying. In terms of the Senate, I'm in favor of a double E Senate, equal and effective, How they're selected should be left to the provinces as it is in the U.S. or was in the U.S. If a province wants to appoint its senators using the premier and the caucus, let them do it. They would have term limits. That would be a big thing. Every 6 years, they'd have to run for re-election or reappointment, et cetera, et cetera. I won't get into the meat and potatoes. I got a really good PowerPoint. I don't think we've got it up on the website at Libertas, but we go quite a lot into depth on how that would potentially work. And that would be back to the rep by pop population system. Yeah, PEI shouldn't be for, but a lot of people in Western Canada don't realize that Quebec is guaranteed 25% of the House. That's another thing. They should be 22 or 23%. 2035 or 2040 is when Alberta passes BC in population. It'll be 2065, 2075 before we catch Quebec, depending on how birth rates and immigration affect things. But the point being is that the West is getting bigger. The new Canada, which Michael Bliss talked about, was basically west of Ontario. I'll give you a stat. So the age pyramids, you ever seen age pyramids? You know, old people, young people? So the age pyramid in Western Canada is the youngest age pyramid in the free world. Okay? The age pyramid east of Manitoba is very similar to Germany, which is dying, okay? Close to Italy's demographics. And it's reflected in their economic vitality too, by the way. Strangely enough, old guys aren't very venturesome, and young guys like to take risk, and it's very much typified by how our economies are operating. So there's the old Canada and the new Canada, and Ontario's got to decide where they want to be. Fundamentally, that's the hinge in all this. So, yeah, electoral reform, rep by pop, true rep by pop, that's what they have in the U.S. Every so many years they reapportion. Some states are going to lose Congress people and others will gain them. One of the big things about illegal immigration in the U.S. is that if you do a proper count, California and New York State might lose a lot more congressional seats to Texas and Florida because of all the illegals that have been incorrectly counted. So anyway.
We have a follow-up question online from Patrick Mullan. He says, I'm interested in thoughts from the group about how Alberta would replace its financial stability, traded benefits, and global reputation in the event that a referendum was successful. Do the benefits outweigh the costs?
So if I'm going to repeat back to Patrick, does everybody know who Patrick is? Patrick is in the Premier's office. I think I guess you'd say he was second in command. He's also on provincial council for membership, yeah. And he owns a very nice restaurant called The Granary in Red Deer. Just put in a plug if you want to support a UCP member. The Granary is the place to go. Their Pilsner beer is really nice and cold, so I quite like that. Anyway, I digress. Back to his question. I guess the implication is that if Alberta became its own entity, would it be treated with less respect in the financial markets? Would our credit rating go down? Would would we be considered some kind of banana republic kind of a thing? And frankly, this constitutional convention and all this responsibility due diligence stuff would go a long way to calming those concerns. But I think when you're a province that basically is, if you're an American wanting to get to Alaska, you drive through it every day. We're a pretty vital link to the 49th state. We're also one of the, I would argue, the most strategic asset that Canada has is Alberta's oil in the oil sands. We, Sheikh Yemeni and others in the OPEC world have acknowledged that the true price controller in the world, if it's allowed to be on oil, is Alberta. We have predictable supply at a predictable cost. Our problem is we can't get it to Tidewater. If we got it to Tidewater, we could literally we would have more power than OPEC. And Yemeni has said as much. So, and I think that the U.S. markets would welcome it with open arms, especially if we were committed to an economic union with the United States And I have all the confidence in the world that if we were going into a referendum and we were to ask poll senators in the U.S., would you be okay with an economic union where we shared your currency and had free trade of resources across the border, I think we'd probably get 90, other than Bernie Sanders and a handful of wingnuts. They'd all vote in favor of an economic union with Alberta if we became our own entity. So I would expect our credit rating would go up, not down, because our biggest problem is going to be Dutch disease, to be blunt. I don't know if you guys are familiar with what Dutch disease is. Dutch disease is oil and gas developments in Holland were so dominant in their economy that the price of labor was going through the roof and they couldn't afford to staff greenhouses and other aspects of it. So Dutch agriculture really suffered for decades because of the really good jobs in the oil and gas industry. Sound familiar, right? So what's interesting, what happened there, what did Holland become? I used to work in a greenhouse, used to manage one, and dealt with Dutch people all the time. They became world leaders in greenhouse technology, right? They have vast tracts of land in Colombia and Africa that they control and have their greenhouses built there. So they literally went somewhere else to produce the flowers, but all the technology and management and skill sets and the high-paying jobs in the greenhouse industry are still in Holland. So I'm not concerned about Dutch disease, but it is something we need to be aware of, that if we became our own, it's vitally important, and I think it's a no-brainer that we share the U.S. currency. That's all of our commodities, which is what we are. Let's face it, we're hewers of wood and drawers of water. We're a resource-based economy. We make money off of that and the technologies applied to that, health and safety, coil tubing, all that stuff. So the U.S. would very much welcome us with open arms, just as an aside, Newfoundland in 1948, when we were discussing the referendum down there, my ancestors, who all wanted to be part of the United States, by the way, but were not given the opportunity to vote on a mandate to become essentially a Puerto Rico to start with and ultimately statehood, because at the time Newfoundland was the most important strategic piece of geography in the world, right after World War II. Anyway, so to answer Patrick's question, I think there are far more positives if we handle it in a responsible manner, without a lot of Sturm and Drang and cheap petty politics. I think our reputation goes up in the world, not down. Just one last point on that, Patrick. My template is a guy named Meikle. I never get his name right. Meikle?
Yeah.
Okay. You get the right dynamic leadership who stick to the fundamentals in terms of economic policy, where we're not going to... If Quebec separated or became independent, I think the markets would crush the Quebec economy, because it would be a bunch of progressives running the government with a completely free hand. I think in Alberta, we'd be a far more fiscally responsible and fiscally powerful entity, and in fact be less weakened by the progressive influences in the rest of Canada. So I think we do a lot better that way. So, okay.
So I can repeat or rephrase the question if you like.
No, I did that. There was a study done by Project Confederation that stated, I don't know if it's a study or research anyways by them, that stated that Alberta as an independent country done right, we would have the 6th largest economy in the world. And Patrick, since you're involved in the politics side, we want to do it right.
All right, can I hear the question again?
Yes. In the event that a referendum was successful, do the benefits outweigh the costs? How would Alberta replace its financial stability, trade benefits, and global reputation?
I like the question. Obviously, for financial stability, we're going to look at our resource sector. We've got what the world wants. Now, we still have to get it to Tidewater. Though we would have more rights and as an independent country to get it to Tidewater than we do as a member of Canada. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea has certain stipulations that landlocked countries are indeed entitled to access to tidewater. As far as our reputation goes, I think it would actually increase our reputation. A new country that's had the nerve to say enough with this atrophied hulk of whatever you want to call it, the slowly dying Canada. We've had enough of it, and we're leaving, because the East, I believe, is slowly dying. We also would be known for freedom, just like our motto, strong and free. Now, of course, this all has to be done correctly, but Albertans show in the way they vote and what they support that this would be done correctly. This is a province that believes in the individual, in the family, in individual rights and freedoms, so on. So I think I think it would actually increase our reputation internationally. I think it also financially, we'd have a very, very good foundation to begin with. Canada might make us try to make us take on some of their debt. As far as I'm concerned, those dues have been paid long since. Draw your attention to Exhibit A, equalization. But yeah, I think that the positives far outweigh the negatives. Now, can we turn that around with a constitutional conference and have the Canadian positives outweigh the independence ones? I don't know, but I think it's worth a try. Does that cover it?
Yeah, and I appreciate you talking about the Constitutional Conference. It's part of going through the process.
Yeah, just two things, not sixth largest. Actually, the night Danielle won the leadership vote, I came up to her and I said, congratulations, you're now premier of the 39th largest economy in the world. I think it's 39th, yeah. So even if we left, we'd still be 39th. I think the question back to Patrick is, if Alberta leaves, obviously we're in far stronger fiscal standing than we are now, where we're seeing a hemorrhaging of various transfer programs, not just equalization, but EI and a few other things I won't get into. But pension, that's another one as well. The other thing is, okay, that's Alberta's predicament. What is the rest of Canada looking like to the rest of the world, right? A basket case. And oh, by the way, if we're literally, the referendum is a go and we're off to we're starting up the independence paperwork, what do you think Saskatchewan's going to do? Think they're sticking around, right? I don't know if you know this, in Saskatchewan, you know what the fifth largest export in Saskatchewan is? It's agriculture. There's 4 above it. Now, if you think we're wealthy in resources, go to Saskatchewan. It is staggering what they have, and they're far more diverse than we are. So I think Canada, the rest of Canada, would be in a far more difficult situation economically in how it's viewed. Not the least of which is, you guys, when I do presentations, I always bring this up, and I think probably the most positive response I get is when I say that Canada sucks. We are a global embarrassment. We have been given so much riches, so much. We've got an actual peace order and good government, generally speaking. We've got a highly educated workforce. Our human resources are world class, bar none. We're on this massively powerful resource base. We're next to along with the United States, the greatest country on earth. We could be the greatest country pound for pound, man for man, and we are pissing it away. We should be embarrassed of it. And when I hear people going on about how great Canada is, I'm going, it's a global disgrace. See, I'm getting all the nodding of the heads. I can go parts of Canada, they think I'm on crack, okay? Canadians need to understand that we suck. We need to be better. We should not, saddle our, 4 generations ahead of us with debt because we want to give out everybody free dental care, okay? We need to be better. We can be better. A better constitution, and an Alberta that's leading this country along with the other enterprising provinces and people. We can make this the greatest country on earth, where we swing above our weight economically, politically, and militarily. And we need to do that. And we need to tell the rest of Canada that's what we want. And if you're not going to do it, well, Alberta will do it on our own. Thanks.
I will argue with him, though, because it is sixth. Once we are in production, because we have full access to Tidewater, we have the open markets where we're not being restricted, we would rise to the sixth largest economy.
Okay, so you actually mentioned Saskatchewan, which is a perfect segue to this next question. What are the opportunities for joint action with Saskatchewan? And I'm just going to extend the question and say, within Confederation or without Confederation? What are those opportunities with Saskatchewan?
Generally speaking, our interests are the same, I believe. Now, in a constitutional conference, that doesn't necessarily hold true as much. As if I remember correctly, Saskatchewan has a rather generous proportion for their MPs. Yes, they get one MP for every 90,000. So they're well ahead of us in representation in the House of Commons, and of course we'd be demanding that that be given up. But on the other hand, we're arguing for an equal Senate. So perhaps they could be convinced through that way. Other than that, I believe generally, like I say, our interests are largely the same. We have very similar economies, similar resources. Of course, they have potash and uranium, and diamonds. Yeah. I think that's about all really I have to say with that. I don't think it's a complex issue, really.
I'll go to the other side of it, outside of Confederation. We're in complete alignment with Saskatchewan on that side of it. Saskatchewan actually has, at this point in time, a higher population that wants to wants independence than Alberta does. So that is working in our favor, but they are a little bit more reserved than we are as Albertans. So they'll pull the plug after they see us pull the plug. But I believe that they would follow right along with us.
First, a little bit of trivia. I think it's 2 ridings in Saskatchewan had the highest Conservative vote in the last federal election, not in Alberta. Traditionally, we've always had the most dominant Conservative ridings, and now Saskatchewan has 2 that have a higher vote portion than we do. In terms of Saskatchewan and separate independence and whatnot, all the better reason to have a constitutional convention before a referendum. Because if it fails, hang on, let's back up the bus here. If we have a constitutional convention, we're going to have a referendum on that outcome if there is one, if there's a contract. Saskatchewan's going to do the same. All the other provinces are going to vote. This is going to be Meech Lake, Charlottetown Part 2, if you will. There will be a referendum just like here, and the consequences might be different. Instead of, well, it just fails, no, we're going to actually leave. So with the Constitutional Convention in play, it's entirely possible if it fails that not only will we be having a referendum, but so will Saskatchewan, that they'll have a clear mandate to have a referendum as well. Because the overlap, the little circles of overlap, what Alberta wants and Quebec wants are very, very similar. 95%, correlation. So I think all the better reason to have a constitutional convention first to get them thinking about, well, if Alberta's leaving, so are we. We don't want to be left behind.
So we have 2 questions left. So the first one has to do with the term constitutional convention. some people are new to politics and they don't understand all the terms yet. And so one person I spoke with on the concept of constitutional convention thought that it meant creating an Alberta constitution for the country of Alberta. And in a sense, that's a great idea too, to think about that new constitution. So can you, in a sense, redefine the constitutional convention you're proposing, but then also speak to the concept of creating a constitution for the future country of Alberta?
So, country or not, Alberta should have a constitution. We did have one years ago, and it was essentially shelved. We also had a Senate years ago, and it was shelved, unfortunately. So, first off, the Constitutional Convention I'm referring to would be at the national level. The mechanisms are in place and all those things. I will say that if it already isn't in place, there are at least one or two resolutions that are going to come forward at the UCP convention in November, that are going to call for the creation of an Alberta Constitution. And we should, I think, very much have an Alberta Constitutional Convention. And much of that Constitutional Convention should have wording that is operational if Alberta became an independent country. So what I'm saying is that the groundwork would be there, and all you have to do is flip a switch if we became an independent entity, and those things go forward. Just to give you an idea, in the U.S., I think almost every state, I could be wrong, has a constitution. The U.S. Constitution is actually based on, in part, on constitutions that the 13 colonies had, and the Massachusetts had a constitution, etc., and they kind of cobbled bits and pieces together. So that would be a separate constitution convention. I very much welcome the idea. We've done a lot of work at Libertas about what those things would look like, especially around the Senate and giving representation. We also have we have the tyranny of majority in Alberta too, right? We have 2/3 of Albertans are urban, and we have 1/3 that isn't, and that's not getting any better. And I find it very interesting that there's a ton of money coming out of Fort Mac. How much of it's staying in Fort Mac? No different than Sudbury. All the royalties coming off the nickel. Where do you think that money winds up? Do you think it goes back to Sudbury? I don't think so, right? So there's a good demand. In the U.S., there's a lot of Senate setups where Senates are based on counties, not on population. So maybe we have equal representation in the Senate based on counties or blocks of counties, if you know what I'm saying, to counterbalance the majority rule of the urban centers versus the minorities in the rural. So good question. I think, we need both. That answers the question. Thanks.
Right. I'll ask for the question before I
keep talking so long you forget the question.
No, it's my memory. It's not your fault.
So we've been speaking about the Constitutional Convention, which would be a federal event inviting members of the federal government and members from each territory and province. But there's also the concept of an Alberta Constitutional Convention, where in a sense we're creating a constitution for Alberta and potentially creating a constitution for the future country of Alberta. So could you speak to that?
All right, for the first part, a Canadian Constitutional Convention would have representatives from each province, and I suppose they'd probably invite the territories to send a small delegation as well. And they would reopen the Canadian Constitution. And depending on the depth, if it's the depth that I believe it should be, we would go through the Constitution line by line by line, making necessary changes, updating things, getting rid of the outrageous aspects of it that treat the West as a colony and so on, and adding things that need to be there as well, like property rights. So that would be hammered out over the period of some months. And then the end result that is agreed upon, or by most, it could be a majority agreement, would be taken then to the provincial leaders and the federal government for ratification. Now, some provinces may wish to hold referendums on it. I don't know. That would be my preference, is to turn it over to the people. So that's generally, I think, how a national one would go. Now, remember, for a national one for a change to be made to the Constitution, it needs to be approved by 7 provinces that represent at least, is it half the population? Yeah, 750. Now, for an Alberta one, I would like to see a draft document created, fairly boilerplate, things like property rights, right to life, so on, just as a starting point. And then town hall it around the province and take from the Albertan people what are important aspects from them. From there, create a draft document that can be voted on in a referendum, again, section by section. Give Albertans a voice through the whole process. That's just off the top of my head what a process could look like. I'd probably want a little more detail than that for diving in, but certainly off the top of my head, that's how I'd see it.
Moving forward, is Daniel Smith the right person to lead Alberta in these negotiations? A comment from an attendee here was, the last UCP convention was a disappointment. What happened to the Alberta Bill of Rights? Nothing. Why not act on the Alberta pension plan with an educational campaign? So is Daniel Smith the right person to lead us going forward, since some people are disappointed with her performance thus far? Or would you propose another leader to lead Alberta in these negotiations?
Yes, she is.
I'm going to say yes, she is.
I'm going to say that it's up to Albertans, and right now that's who we have. And I've known Danielle for 25 years. She is unbelievably intelligent, especially as it pertains to policy and whatnot. At a constitutional convention, frankly, as happened in the United States, it wasn't the leaders of the states that did the talking in those conventions. It was the people in the background with vast knowledge and vast experience in these issues who hashed it out at a very, very high level, and that's what I would anticipate happening here. Clearly, the leaders will be involved from time to time, but unlike Meech Lake, where it was just the leaders and nobody else, it'll be a far more thoroughgoing and thoughtful process. Is she the right person to do it? At this point, sure. I don't see her being the wrong person. How's that? And I know that's bad praise. I don't mean that as, if you know what I'm saying, it's not meant as a criticism. Everybody has their flaws. God knows I do. But the right people will be in the room, I think. I think there are some really, really talented people in Alberta who would be in the room to represent our interests and fight for those interests. And Danielle would be one of those. I have no doubt with her grasp of the issues. She's a very quick study in all those things. She would not be long before she was on top of that file as good as anybody. And if there's one thing I can say about Danielle, she loves Alberta. She's tireless in representing it. It's everything and everything to her. She is an Albertan first, absolutely no question of that. So I would never question her emotional, or whatever you want to call it, motivation in terms of her decision making. She's doing it because she loves Alberta. If you might or might not agree with it, what she's doing, that's another story.
Thank you. And now I'd like to invite each of you to deliver some closing comments. And in your closing comments, if you could each include at least one call to action for the people who have heard your messages today and the people that are watching online and will watch online. What is at least one call to action to move forward with these goals?
Well, since I got the mic first, I am going to give 2 calls for action. The first thing is that I and both of these gentlemen are going to say the same thing. Write a letter to the Premier, the MLA, and Jason Stephan calling for constitutional, requesting that she call for a constitutional convention. The second thing is I would urge everybody to go online, go to the Government of Canada website, and research Bill C5. Make your own decision on it, and then call your MP, or write your MP. Make your voice known once you read that proposed bill.
Thanks. First off, talk to your neighbors, talk to your families, talk to your friends, your co-workers. Right now, Alberta is a colony. We are a colony of Eastern Canada. We do not have an adequate say in this country, and the situation is wholly unacceptable. And the more people that understand that will only increase the weight their cause brings to the table. So that's the first. The second call to action is, indeed, write a letter. Write a letter telling the provincial government and the appropriate person in the government. If you're not sure, just fire it at the Premier's office. But ask for that constitutional conference. Ask for an advertising campaign on the Alberta pension plan. Ask for all these things. Make your voice heard. So those are the two that I would call for. Thanks. Gordon.
I got to follow up on the colony comment. For those of you who watched the movie Train Spotting, I don't remember, but apologies to Ewan McGregor talking about the Scottish people being ruled by not just wankers, but effeminate wankers, the British, the English, sorry. Anyway, just brought that to mind. These events, I'm 2 and 3/4 hours from where I live. Where are you these days? 2.5. You're 2.5. We get out and do this because, honestly, I could be golfing tonight, well, if it wasn't raining, but this is too important, and I'm prepared to drive however far I got to drive. I'm prepared to annoy Patrick Malkin to no end, and whoever else to try and get to make what I think needs to happen. If you can motivate other people to get out to events like this, to make it, drive the morale of us and others to get out there. Alberta Prosperity Project, to its credit, I think, is trying to be even-handed about it and allowing people like me to be the more moderate voices. I think hopefully the less mercurial and calmer voices to also be involved in a discussion. That would be a big thing. Money matters, believe it or not. I don't need money, but I'm just saying that in order for us to book halls and maybe do some marketing, get bigger audiences, get in, and I think ultimately we need to get into the cities and have events in the cities and organize in the cities and take the message to where it really needs to be taken. And that gets people focusing. So I just in my last words, and of course I got the mic. Listen, you don't have to be here, but you are. And I thank you very much for that. I think that a lot of people in this province care very deeply about where this province is going to go and where we're going as a people and as a nation. And the more they care, I think the more they see what we need to be doing going forward. Thanks.
At this time, I just want to invite everybody here to give a big round of applause to our presenters, please. Thank you so much for coming out to Barrhead County. We just really appreciate you all being here and presenting. This event has been recorded. It's available now on the Facebook page of myself, Benita Pedersen. It will soon be available. Oh, everybody smile and wave because Max loves his group pictures. And so it's on my Facebook page, Benita Pedersen. It will soon be on the Facebook page, Alberta Independence Movement, plus the Facebook page, Alberta Conservative Association. And, of course, it will be available in the coming days at freedomcalendar.net. And the TikTok called Sweet Cherry Pie. Did I get that right? Okay, that's her TikTok. So thank you all to those who are here recording and rebroadcasting. We appreciate you. And to everyone who came, we hope you will share the word online or otherwise. Perhaps you'd like to organize or host a similar meeting. There's various guest presenters and available, including these three. And thank you again, everyone, for being here.